So our focus is on long-term strategy in a short-term world, and Mario Abreu, Vice President of the Environment for Tetra Pak. We have Philippe Joubert, who's founder of Earth on Board. We'll explain what that means in a moment. Greg Lowe is Global Head of Resilience and Sustainability at Aon, and David Croft, Global Environment and Sustainability Director at Diageo. So I think we want to try to see how the corporate world really puts long-term strategy in place at a time when there are these tremendous short-term pressures. Greg, perhaps I start with you, coming at it very much from an insurance aspect and trying to bring, I think, some original thinking to that. How does the risk element help in this process, trying to focus on the long term?
Well, Daniel, yes, absolutely. You know, I tend to frame sustainability as this sort of interaction between long-term risk management, but it's not only about risk management, it is about innovation as well. And if I think about the way we approach this both internally and externally, you know, certainly internally, as a professional services firm, you know, we don't have quite the same impacts that someone in the manufacturing or energy sector has. But I think we also realize that our investment decisions do set a pathway to the future. We try to account for that when we're making long-term investment decisions in things that have environmental impacts, so in our real estate choices. But I think the bigger impact we can make is through the products and services that we talk to our clients about. And absolutely, we're in the business of risk. We talk to our clients about long-term catastrophe risks, how they can quantify and model those, to actually stretch out the viewpoint on some of the financial impacts they might face. But likewise, on the innovation side of things, we try to de-risk technologies, emerging technologies, things like energy efficiency, so that people have long-term financial certainty to empower innovation.
I suppose there are two questions that follow from this. One is the work that needs to be done. I think it's quite intellectually challenging work to quantify these long-term risks. So some of the risks are quite sort of novel risks in terms of the industry, right? And trying to get a dependable view of how you can actually then deliver a product to or present a product to a client. And secondly is whether, even when presented with this, they're actually receptive to it, or do they just say, well, I don't want to worry about this sort of risk, it's too far out there and my directors aren't necessarily going to support me on this. So could you talk a bit to both those, the intellectual work and the reception that you get for it?
Yes, I mean, I think on the intellectual work, you know, one thing that we're working really hard on is trying to take this incredible tool, this incredible set of analytical tools that we've developed primarily for our reinsurance clients, and actually apply some of that thinking to portfolios of assets for our corporate clients. And that's really looking at issues of risk exposure, of predicting financial losses, using modeling tools. But I think the bigger challenge there is not actually adapting those tools to corporate use. That's something I think that's moving along quite nicely. I think the bigger challenge is finding the right economic buyers in our client base. One thing we've noticed is that the list of risk challenges given at the World Economic Forum, for instance, you know, climate and environmental issues are actually quite high in that list. We do a risk manager survey every year, and there's a big discrepancy in the people who are making decisions within risk management in companies and what their CEOs are saying. So I think there is a challenge in trying to deliver that. One thing I'd actually like to see a bit more of, and maybe this is a call to action to this audience, is there needs to be better dialogue and interaction between people in sustainability roles and people in risk management roles. Some of the most receptive and interesting discussions I've had have been through people who work in sustainability at some of our larger corporate clients coming to us and say, look, can you solve this challenge for me around climate risk? You know, what are some of my expected losses? How do I risk engineer my buildings to protect us against future climate change? And that's actually been a way to empower the risk management team to think a little bit more innovatively.
So I think this leads into, Philippe, your work on the board, making corporate work, because often these decisions will rise up to the board, and the board does have responsibility for sustainability, but doesn't always realize that it has responsibility for sustainability. Tell us about your work, first of all. Why you've developed this Earth on Board idea, and how you see boards taking on this responsibility.
Mostly by what Mark just expressed just before me so eloquently. When, as you know, I was CEO of a big company, and I've been working in this area for a few years. And then when I was talking with my fellow CEOs and say, why are you not doing more your business model is dead, so why don't you change? And normally the answer is my board doesn't ask for this. My board is asking for short-term results, etc., etc. You know the story. So this puzzled me because I am now a board member, and I know that my fiduciary duties are very clear. They can change from a country to another, but the number one is you have to take care of the interest, the long-term interest of the company, not of the shareholders, not of the company. So if you agree with this, your behavior should change. And I really saw that this knowledge was very low in the population of board members. This is like a hidden population that has been forgotten in very nice, comfortable boardrooms. So I decided to try to challenge this. First of all, I team up with Cambridge Institute for Sustainable Leadership, and I am proposing to dialogue and awareness session to the board, and secondly, with an ecosystem of organization like WBCSD or the B Team or Client Earth, we are trying to now to do what Mark was saying. Let's try to move now the regulatory framework of this very, very central body.
And do you find that you're getting a good reception in this, or is it a sort of still a slightly sideshow as far as boardroom?
At least we are getting. No, we have several good success already. We have made some very good progress. It obviously depends on the country. Some countries are more or less open to this. But the receptivity is very good because when the board member understand that they are collectively responsible for a lot of the consequence of what they are making as a decision, and they are not fulfilling their duty, and there are other duties that we can discuss later, they are really opening to this.
So what's the most important, the single most important thing that a board can do to actually make sure that this perspective is properly taken into account?
Yeah, we have written what is Earth's competent board. The first thing that the board has to come back to is the purpose of the business. We have to stop these things about business have been made to generate short-term profit for shareholder. We need the short-term profit for shareholder to survive, but we are not being created for this. And this is not why we have received a license to operate. Number one, we have to come back to this. Number two, we have to organize correctly. We have to have the right committee. We should not allow the board to push sustainability in the kind of green committee on the side. I am advocating, and I have been successful several times. This committee should be called Strategy and Sustainability. Second, you have to look at how you work. You will be amazed when you look at the agenda of the boards, the time they spend of discussing the bonus of the CEO, and the time they spend on discussing long-term issue is a joke.
Why was one not surprised by this somehow?
It's a joke, but yes, but because finance sector has kind of hijacked the board, and this is absolutely unacceptable. And the board should not accept, because they will be held on responsibility, because they are responsible. This is written on this. So this is the second thing. And the third thing is we have to challenge the CEO. There is a clear definition about who is in charge of the long term, and this is the board, and the CEO has to run the company according to the direction we are going to the company, and not according to what he thinks is good for his short-term bonus.
Yeah, it's really
to be simple.
Well, let's go to a specific company now, and Diageo. David, obviously water is a key concern, strategic concern for a drinks company. How have you incorporated a sort of strategic long-term view of sustainability, particularly, I guess, with respect to water?
Well, I think we look at sustainability and particularly water as part of a materiality conversation to start off with. And as you'd expect, as a drinks company, water's high up there alongside climate change, alongside balanced lifestyle, alkaline society. Then it's a case of really how we take that forward and make certain that it's both part of the risk footprint, to Greg's question, but also part of the growth and the opportunity curve. And that creates scale support to drive activity forward. And we have a water blueprint that allows us to think about a very holistic view of water and our operations in terms of sourcing and how we would work in agriculture to improve landscape management of water to support that side of things, how we work within our own particular operating environment in manufacturing and how we minimize water there and look at replenishment around that, particularly in water-stressed areas, how we work with a wider community base, because us having water and other people not having water is clearly a risk and it's inequitable. And then finally, how we work at a government and an advocacy level to promote better practice, because at the end of the day, much of the stuff that we do in the sustainability agenda to create growth or to mitigate risk is inherently dependent upon a policy environment. So how can we work with others, with governments, to line up policy environments for growth to deliver what we would talk about in terms of shared value? And that then becomes the focus of much of the discussion on the sustainability agenda.
But can you tell us a little bit about how the policy formation on this, how that process works? Because in order to take this long-term view, you need to have the space, the time to step right back and look well apart from sort of ongoing operations and take the 10-year, possibly the 20 or even longer view. So how has that worked in your case? Do you get given the leeway to do this? Do you get given a team to do it? Do you need the support of someone right at the top of the organisation?
Well, you need all of those, to put it simply. When we started the work on materiality, it isn't just about the next 5 years. It's about the 2030 horizon. It's about what the macro trends for 2050 will be. And then it's starting to distill that against more external information. For example, what are we seeing in terms of climate change and particularly weather pattern activity in various parts of the world where we might work? How do we then start to plan our operating footprint and our growth against that? How are we having and creating the right type of dialogue with governments? So take somewhere like Kenya, Tusker beer, huge, the largest beer in Kenya. We're naturally going to have a discussion with the Kenyan government and particularly the Nairobi local government about how our brewery works, our abstraction levels, what we're putting back into it, and what they see and we see as the growth curve around that. And the same is true if I think broader than our own operations, when I think about landscape management of water to support agriculture. I mean, before too long, investors will be asking us to report on climate change risks that affect that parts of our supply network. And there, the discussion around landscape management and replenishment and improving agricultural practice is absolutely critical to support not only a mitigation of risk in the short to medium term, but also the growth potential, not just for us, but for rural economies more broadly. That's a conversation that has to happen at a policy level with government, locally and nationally. It
very quickly gets very broad indeed. Now, is that something that resonates with you at Tetra Pak, Mario? Is it clearly that it's not so much water, but it's other materials and so on, but you're also involved in strategic initiatives. How does the process work for you and what's the most important?
No, absolutely, thanks. I think this is a very broad question because I would have to say to Philippe here that part of our strategic committee's responsibility is to look into sustainability. It's about a sustainable business. And I don't think we can jump into something very quickly, but we have decided, as part of the senior management, they have decided that we would have a 10-year strategy rather than a 3-year strategy back in 2010. And in that strategy, 4 pillars were created. Environment was one of them. And that started to set the scene for us to consider more long-term perspectives. Recently, we have committed to the science-based targets, addressing what Johan Rockström was talking about today. We looked at what climate footprint we should have towards 2030 and 2040, and we had our climate target approved by the SBT initiative, which has the UN Global Compact behind it and the WWF and the WRI. And we have, towards today, we have been working on a number of things like replacing oil-based polymers in our packaging by renewable materials, so replacing oil with plants, which is something that we heard about today as well. So it's been part of a strategy on three pillars: on renewability, on climate, and on recyclability. And today it has had to have a lot of work in terms of mapping. We realized that 90% of the emissions in our value chain are happening either upstream or downstream from us. So to the point about Walmart made before, that's sort of the type of thinking you need to do, is go beyond what you are impacting yourself and try to understand how can you actually
Do your customers care about this, actually? Do they ask you questions about this, or you have to take responsibility for that full cycle?
Of course they do, and I think Walmart would be one that would ask for these types of questions. And I think there are two sides to this story. One is what you want to be as a company, and what are your principles, your purpose, your values, and what the customers expect from you. So if, hearing from David, of course, for a company in the drinks area, sustainable packaging is important. So we need to react to the expectations of sustainable packaging, but we also need to think about what is a sustainable business for ourselves.
So we're facing a conflict between the short term and the long term on this panel, because the short term is that we want to eat, the long term is that we have a lot of interest in this panel. I'm actually going to defy the advice of my conference colleagues and say who would like to ask a very, very quick question, so that we manage to get at least a question in before lunch. Who would like to ask or are you all so concerned with your... Well, in that case, I think I can firmly conclude that we're short-termist in this room, not long-termist. But I want to just do one last, if I could ask you to do 30 seconds each on your one most important element that you would say to try to shift perceptions from short to long term within your own business or within the companies that you deal with. Greg, would you like to start? You're obviously, part of your effort is to try to persuade your customers to take this serious. So what's the one thing that you would like to see happen?
I think people need to think about the investments in assets that are long-term, and to take a view on what the risk exposure to those assets are going to be over a 10 to 20 year time span, and there are tools and techniques to help identify that.
Philippe, how do you get boards? What's the one thing you're going to do to get boards to be laser-like focused on the long term?
First, we will go and make them aware of their fundamental responsibility, and we continue through this. We will influence the regulatory framework to make sure that we have a clear definition of fiduciary duty. And third, I will remind them something very important. We are not at a board, you are not supposed to be specialists in everything, but we have to act with due diligence and due care. And I think Paris 2015 will be the year of the tipping point, because after Paris and the SDG, you cannot say anymore that you don't know. So being climato-sceptic, as we have seen, you can be on a personal view, but if you are a board member, you cannot be climato-sceptic because you are not acting in the long-term interest of the company.
Stop seeing sustainability as either a CSR conversation or an addition to what you do in core business. Bring it to part of core business. Talk about it in language that motivates the core business. Preferably talk about it in terms of creating growth. And because no business exists or will thrive in isolation, talk about creating inclusive growth for the future.
Mario, last word.
I think from a science-based perspective and SDGs, we talked so much today, I think these are really good tools because they enable business to take action, they enable level playing fields, they enable every organization to look at what they should be doing towards 2030, to 2040 and 50. And rather than looking at them as complicated, complex, I think we should just start looking at how can you influence, how can you impact. And I think this is a message to industry in general.
Excellent. Thank you all very much indeed for a fascinating session. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we do now have lunch upstairs in the gallery where we will have a chance, I hope, to continue these conversations. The keynote interview with Usha Ramanari on water security is going to begin here at 1:50 sharp. So if I were you, I'd eat and talk quickly and then come back down here for 1:50. Thank you.